At 9:12 on the morning of June 6, 1944, Marine Derrick Cakebread dropped into chest-deep water off Queen Red sector of Sword Beach, watching German machine gun tracers skip across the channel surface toward his landing craft. 22 years old, 2 years in the Royal Marines, 0 combat kills. The Germans had positioned over 500 machine guns along this stretch of Normandy coast, supported by 50 mortars and 90 artillery pieces. Within the first hour of the British landing, dozens of commandos would be cut down before they ever reached dry sand. Cakebread was not supposed to be here. 2 years earlier, he had been cutting hair in Tottenham, North London. His clients were factory workers, shopkeepers, old men who wanted their sideburns trimmed just so. He had steady hands and good eyes. He noticed details other people missed, but none of that mattered when the conscription papers arrived in March 1942. The Royal Marines took him because they needed bodies. Britain was losing men faster than it could train replacements. Cakebread reported to the 5th Battalion Royal Marines and expected to become just another rifleman, one of thousands learning to march in formation and fire on command. Then something strange happened. One morning in late 1942, the quartermaster handed Cakebread a wooden crate and told him to sign for it. Inside was an American P-14 sniper rifle with a telescopic sight. Cakebread had not volunteered for sniper training. He had not requested special duty. Someone in the battalion had simply looked at his records, noticed his occupation, and made an assumption. A hairdresser, steady hands, attention to detail. Perhaps he could shoot. Within days, Cakebread found himself on a truck heading to Penally in South Wales, where the British Army ran its sniper school. The other recruits were infantrymen, hunters, competitive shooters. Cakebread was a barber from North London who had never fired a rifle at anything more distant than a paper target. The instructors at Penally did not care about his background. They cared about results. For 6 weeks, Cakebread learned skills that had nothing to do with barbering and everything to do with killing. Zeroing and grouping, field firing, methods of judging distance by eye alone. The trainees used mud to blacken their faces and camouflage nets over their heads. They practiced shooting at targets between 100 and 500 yards, learning to read wind speed from the movement of trees and grass. Most importantly, they learned patience. A sniper did not spray bullets and hope for the best. A sniper waited, watched, calculated, then fired once. Cakebread discovered he was good at waiting. Years of standing behind a barber's chair, making small talk while his hands worked automatically, had taught him to be still for hours at a time. His eyes, trained to spot an uneven hairline from across the room, could detect movement at distances that made other trainees squint. By the end of the course, he was one of the top marksmen in his class. But marksmanship on a Welsh training range meant nothing. The real test would come in combat, against enemies who shot back. And in 1943, Cakebread's battalion was dissolved. The 5th Royal Marines ceased to exist. Its men were scattered across new units being formed for the invasion of Europe. Cakebread was assigned to 45 Royal Marine Commando, one of the elite assault units in the British military. Commandos were not ordinary soldiers. They were trained to operate behind enemy lines, to kill silently, to survive where regular infantry could not. And they needed snipers. In November 1943, Cakebread arrived at Achnacarry in the Scottish Highlands for the infamous Commando Basic Training Course. Men who failed were sent back to regular units in disgrace. Men who quit were worse than failures. The instructors used live ammunition during exercises. Trainees died in training accidents with disturbing regularity. Cakebread passed. If you want to see how this Tottenham barber performed when German bullets started flying for real, please like this video. It helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Cakebread. After Achnacarry came the advanced course. Deer stalking with Scottish gamekeepers in the Highlands. Learning to move through wilderness without leaving tracks. Learning to lie motionless for hours in freezing rain. Learning to kill a target and disappear before anyone knew a shot had been fired. By spring of 1944, Marine Derrick Cakebread was assigned to A Troop, 45 Commando, as part of the brigade sniper section under the 1st Special Service Brigade. His commanding officer was Brigadier Lord Lovett, one of the most famous soldiers in the British Army. On June 5, 1944, Cakebread boarded a landing craft infantry at Warsash. He cleaned his rifle one final time. A Lee-Enfield No. 4 Mark 1T, fitted with a No. 32 telescopic sight. The scope offered 3.5 times magnification. The rifle could place 7 consecutive shots inside a 5-inch circle at 200 yards. By dawn on June 6th, he would learn whether any of it mattered. The largest amphibious invasion in human history was about to begin, and somewhere on that beach, German snipers were already waiting. The landing craft hit a sandbar at 9:08, and the ramp dropped into 4 feet of churning water. Cakebread went over the side with his rifle held above his head, fighting the weight of his equipment as waves knocked him sideways. Around him, men from 45 Commando struggled toward the beach through a chaos of explosions, gunfire, and drowning soldiers. Sword Beach was not supposed to be this difficult. The naval bombardment had been pounding German positions since 5:30 that morning. Hundreds of rockets had screamed toward the shore. Heavy bombers had dropped thousands of tons of explosives on the coastal defenses. Intelligence reports had promised that German resistance would be suppressed by the time the commandos landed. Intelligence reports were wrong. German machine gunners had survived the bombardment in their concrete bunkers. Now, they were firing directly into the waves of men waiting ashore. Mortar rounds exploded in the shallows, sending up geysers of water and shrapnel. Cakebread saw a commando 3 meters to his left take a bullet and disappear beneath the surface without a sound. The 1st Special Service Brigade had landed at approximately 0840, 90 minutes after the initial assault waves. By then, the beach should have been secured. Instead, Cakebread found himself running through a graveyard of burning vehicles and dead infantry. Sherman tanks sat immobilized in the sand, their tracks blown off by mines. Medics dragged wounded men toward whatever cover they could find. The noise was beyond anything training had prepared him for. Cakebread's job was not to fight on the beach. His job was to survive the beach, move inland, and link up with the 6th Airborne Division holding the bridges over the Orne River and Caen Canal. Those bridges were the key to the entire eastern flank of the invasion. If the Germans recaptured them, they could pour reinforcements into Normandy and push the Allies back into the sea. The commandos assembled near the seawall and began moving east toward Weestrum. Brigadier Lord Lovett led from the front, accompanied by his personal piper, Bill Millen, who played the bagpipes as German bullets cracked overhead. It was an act of calculated madness designed to steady the nerves of frightened men. The commandos followed the sound of the pipes through streets filled with rubble and bodies. Cakebread moved with A Troop, his sniper rifle slung across his back. There was no time for precision shooting in this chaos. The fighting was close quarters, building to building, room to room. German soldiers appeared in windows and doorways, fired bursts from their Schmeisser submachine guns, and disappeared before anyone could return accurate fire. By early afternoon, the brigade had reached the bridges at Benouville. The glider troops of the 6th Airborne had seized both crossings in a daring night assault and had been holding them against German counterattacks for nearly 12 hours. When Lord Lovett arrived, he famously apologized for being 2.5 minutes late, but the commandos had no time to rest. German forces were massing to the east, determined to crush the British bridgehead before it could be reinforced. The men of 45 Commando crossed the Orne River and swung north toward their objective, the village of Franceville-Plage on the coast. They never reached it. At approximately 1500 hours, word came from brigade headquarters. The situation had changed. German resistance was stronger than expected in the area around Amfreville and La Plaine. The commandos were ordered to dig in and establish defensive positions on the high ground east of the Orne. Franceville could wait. Survival could not. Cakebread's unit took up positions near the Château d'Amfreville, a stone manor house that offered commanding views of the surrounding farmland. To the east lay the village of Breville-les-Monts, still in German hands. To the south, the men of the 9th Parachute Battalion were holding the Château Saint-Côme with fewer than 200 exhausted paratroopers. The British had established what military planners called the Orne Bridgehead. It was a narrow strip of territory east of the river, roughly 5 kilometers deep and 8 kilometers wide. Inside this bridgehead, 12,000 British soldiers faced elements of 3 German divisions. For the next 3 months, this patch of Norman farmland would become one of the most dangerous places on Earth. The fighting would be constant, brutal, and intimate. Artillery barrages every day, infantry attacks every night, and between the lines, in the orchards and hedgerows and ruined buildings, snipers from both sides would hunt each other like predators in a jungle. This was the war Derrick Cakebread had trained for. Not the chaos of the beach landing, not the street fighting in Weestram, but the patient, methodical work of finding a target, calculating the distance and squeezing the trigger before the enemy knew he was there. On the evening of June 6th, Cakebread cleaned his rifle and prepared his equipment. His Lee-Enfield was zeroed for 300 yards. His ammunition pouch held 50 rounds of carefully selected 303 cartridges. His Denison smock, the same camouflage jacket worn by British paratroopers, would help him blend into the Norman hedgerows. Somewhere out there, German snipers were doing exactly the same thing. The Orne Bridgehead was about to become a killing ground, and within days, a former hairdresser from Tottenham would begin compiling a tally that would make him one of the deadliest British snipers of the entire Normandy campaign. But first, he had to survive the night. German artillery had already begun ranging in on the commando positions around Amfreville. The shells walked closer with each salvo, methodically searching for targets in the darkness. The Germans attacked before dawn on June 7th. Artillery shells screamed into the commando positions around Amfreville at 04:15, followed by waves of infantry from the 857th Grenadier Regiment. The paratroopers and commandos held their ground, but casualties mounted with every assault. Lieutenant Colonel Reese, the commanding officer of 45 Commando, was hit by a sniper on D-Day itself while moving between the bridges over the Caen Canal and Orne River. The bullet struck his left leg, and Major Nickel Gray took command of the unit. It was a stark reminder that German marksmen were just as deadly as British ones. The enemy was watching. The enemy was patient. The enemy knew how to kill from a distance. For the first 2 days, Cakebread fought as a regular infantryman. The situation was too fluid for sniper operations. German attacks came from multiple directions, and every rifle was needed on the defensive perimeter. Men fired from hastily dug trenches, slept in shifts of 30 minutes, and ate cold rations when they ate at all. But by June 8th, the lines had stabilized enough for the brigade to organize its sniper assets. Lieutenant Brian Semaine, the intelligence officer and author of the unit history that would later be titled Commando Men, formed the brigade sniper section. Sniper pairs from each commando unit were pulled together into a specialized team that would operate independently across the bridgehead. Cakebread was paired with Marine Tommy Treacher, another sniper from 45 Commando's A Troop. The two men had trained together at Achnacarry and had developed the kind of silent understanding that kept snipers alive. One would spot, one would shoot. They would watch each other's backs in the killing zone between the lines. Their first mission came on June 9th. Lieutenant Semaine briefed them at 0500. They were to pass through the forward positions held by 3 Commando, move approximately 800 yards into no man's land, and establish observation posts near Longmere Farm. Their orders were to observe German movements on the road network, report on the effectiveness of British artillery strikes, and engage any targets of opportunity. Targets of opportunity. The military euphemism for killing human beings. Cakebread and Treacher moved out before first light, crawling through hedgerows still wet with dew. The Norman countryside was a maze of small fields bordered by thick vegetation, ancient trees, and sunken lanes that had been carved into the earth over centuries. It was perfect terrain for a sniper. Every hedge offered concealment. Every tree could hide a shooter. Every shadow might contain death. They established 2 positions approximately 20 yards apart, close enough to provide mutual support, but far enough to avoid being killed by a single mortar round. Cakebread settled into a shallow depression beneath a hedge, arranged his camouflage netting over his head and shoulders, and began to wait. The wait was everything. A sniper who moved too soon was a dead sniper. A sniper who fired at the wrong target gave away his position and invited artillery retaliation. Patience was not just a virtue in this work, it was survival. For 3 hours, nothing happened. German trucks moved on distant roads. Soldiers walked between buildings in the occupied villages. But none of them came within effective range, and none of them presented targets worth the risk of revealing his position. Then, shortly after 0930, Cakebread spotted movement near a farmhouse 400 yards to the east. A German officer emerged from behind a stone wall, binoculars raised to his face, scanning the British lines. He was conducting reconnaissance of his own, probably preparing for another infantry assault. Cakebread adjusted his scope. The number 32 telescopic sight had a bullet drop compensation drum calibrated in 50-yard increments. At 400 yards, the .303 round would drop approximately 18 inches from the point of aim. He dialed in the correction, steadied his breathing, and placed the crosshairs on the center of the officer's chest. The trigger pull on a Lee-Enfield was crisp and predictable. Cakebread had dry-fired this rifle thousands of times. He knew exactly how much pressure was required to release the firing pin. He squeezed. The rifle kicked against his shoulder. The officer dropped. There was no dramatic collapse, no theatrical clutching at the wound. One moment the German was standing with his binoculars raised. The next moment he was on the ground, motionless. At 400 yards, the sound of the shot would reach the target almost a full second after the bullet. The men around the fallen officer would not immediately understand what had happened. Cakebread was already moving. He stayed low, crawling backward through the hedge, putting distance between himself and the firing position. German soldiers would soon be searching for the source of that shot. Mortars would be zeroed in on the suspected location. Anyone still lying in that depression when the retaliation came would die. He reached Treacher's position and signaled with his hand. 1 kill confirmed. They would move to their secondary observation point and wait for the response to subside. It was the 1st of June, 1944. The tally had begun. The routine established itself within days. Before dawn, Cakebread and Treacher would pass through the forward commando lines and disappear into the hedgerows of no man's land. They carried minimal equipment: rifle, ammunition, water, a single day's rations. Anything more would slow them down when speed meant survival. They operated for 6 to 8 hours at a stretch, observing German positions, noting troop movements, and waiting for opportunities. When dusk approached, they withdrew to British lines before the Germans sent their own patrols into the darkness. The enemy owned the night in those first weeks. Moving after sunset was an invitation to die. The Orne Bridgehead had become a static front. Neither side had the strength to break through. The British needed to hold until reinforcements could expand the invasion perimeter. The Germans needed to contain the bridgehead until they could mass enough armor for a decisive counterattack. In the meantime, both armies bled each other through artillery, mortars, and snipers. Cakebread learned the ground intimately. Every ditch, every ruined barn, every gap in the hedgerows where a man could observe without being observed. He learned which farmhouses the Germans used as command posts, which roads they traveled during resupply runs, which fields they crossed when moving between positions. He also learned where the German snipers operated. They were good. Many had fought on the Eastern Front, where the sniper war between German and Soviet marksmen had produced some of the deadliest shooters in military history. They used the same tactics Cakebread employed: camouflage, patience, single-aimed shots followed by immediate relocation. The difference was experience. Some of these men had been killing since 1941. On June 11th, Cakebread nearly died. He had established a position overlooking a road junction near Brayville when a bullet cracked past his head, missing by inches. He had not seen the muzzle flash. He had not heard the shot until after the round passed. The German sniper had spotted him first. Cakebread froze. Moving now would confirm his position. The German would be watching through his own scope, waiting for any sign of life. For 20 minutes, Cakebread lay motionless, barely breathing, while sweat soaked through his uniform. Then, slowly, he began to crawl backward, using the hedgerow for cover, moving no more than a few inches at a time. It took him 2 hours to withdraw 300 yards. When he reached Treacher's position, his hands were shaking. The near miss changed his approach. He became more careful about selecting positions, more attentive to the angles from which he could be observed. He started using multiple hides during a single mission, shifting every hour to prevent the enemy from fixing his location. The German who had nearly killed him had taught him a lesson that no training course could provide. By mid-June, Cakebread's tally had reached double digits. The kills came in 1s and 2s, never in dramatic clusters. A machine gunner spotted adjusting his weapon. A mortar crew member standing too long in the open. An officer consulting a map with his subordinates, unaware that 400 yards away, a former hairdresser from Tottenham was centering the crosshairs on his chest. Lord Lovett noticed. The brigadier made a point of knowing his best soldiers, and the reports from Lieutenant Semane's sniper section consistently highlighted Cakebread's effectiveness. In his memoirs, March Past, Lovett would later describe the psychological impact of the snipers on German morale in the La Plaine area. The enemy could not move freely. Officers avoided open ground. Soldiers traveled between positions at a crouch, always watching the hedgerows, always afraid. Fear was a weapon. Every German who hesitated before crossing an open field, every officer who refused to expose himself during reconnaissance, every soldier who kept his head down instead of returning fire, represented a small victory for the British. Cakebread was not just killing men, he was paralyzing an army. But the Germans adapted. They brought in their own sniper teams to hunt the British marksmen. They increased mortar coverage of suspected sniper positions. They established observation posts specifically tasked with spotting muzzle flashes and calling in artillery. On June 13th, the 857th Grenadier Regiment launched a major assault on the commando positions. The attack began with the heaviest artillery bombardment Cakebread had experienced since D-Day. Shells fell for 90 minutes without pause, churning the earth around Amfreville into a moonscape of craters and shattered trees. When the barrage lifted, German infantry emerged from Breville in company strength. They advanced through the smoke and dust, expecting to find the British defenders dead or stunned. Instead, they walked into a wall of fire from commandos who had survived in their slit trenches. Cakebread was on the line that morning. There was no time for careful aim, no opportunity for the patient work of a sniper. He fired as fast as he could work the bolt, dropping magazine after magazine into the grass beside him, sending rounds toward the gray shapes moving through the haze. The attack broke against the commando positions like a wave against a seawall. German bodies littered the fields in front of Amfreville. The survivors retreated to Breville, leaving their wounded crying in the open ground. That night, Cakebread cleaned his rifle and counted his remaining ammunition. 14 rounds of match-grade .303. 40 rounds of standard ball. Not enough for another assault like that one. The resupply convoy was overdue, and nobody knew when more ammunition would arrive. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, in the darkness of the Norman countryside, German snipers were preparing for tomorrow. The Battle of Breville began on the night of June 12th. The village had been a thorn in the British position since D-Day, sitting on high ground that gave German observers a direct view into the heart of the Orne Bridgehead. From Breville, enemy artillery spotters could direct fire onto the bridges at Benouville, the glider landing zones at Ronville, and the commando positions around Amfreville. As long as the Germans held that ridge, no one in the bridgehead was safe. Major General Richard Gale, commander of the 6th Airborne Division, decided the village had to fall. He assembled every available unit for the assault: the 12th Parachute Battalion, D Company of the 12th Devonshire Regiment, a squadron of Sherman tanks from the 13th 18th Royal Hussars, and fire support from 3 field artillery regiments, a medium artillery regiment, and the division's own air landing light regiment. The attack jumped off at 2200 hours. Cakebread watched from the commando positions at La Plaine as the British artillery opened up, saturating Breville with high explosive. The ground shook with each salvo. Orange flashes lit the horizon like heat lightning. Then, the infantry advanced across 400 yards of open ground toward the German trenches. It was a slaughter on both sides. The paratroopers walked into heavy machine gun fire and pre-registered mortar concentrations. German defenders who had survived the bombardment emerged from their bunkers and fought with the desperation of men who knew they could not retreat. By the time the crossroads in the center of Breville fell to the British, C Company of the 12th Parachute Battalion had been reduced to 18 men. Brigadier Lord Lovett was wounded during the battle. A shell exploded near his observation post, sending shrapnel into his back and side. He was evacuated to England the following day and would take no further part in the Normandy campaign. Command of the 1st Special Service Brigade passed to Brigadier Derrick Mills Roberts, a veteran of the Dieppe raid who had led 6th Commando ashore on D-Day. The capture of Breville did not end the fighting. German counterattacks continued for days, each one beaten back with diminishing British reserves. The Orne Bridgehead held, but the cost was devastating. The 6th Airborne Division had lost nearly half its effective strength in the first 2 weeks of the invasion. Some battalions existed only on paper. For Cakebread, the fall of Breville changed the tactical situation. With the high ground secured, British observers could now see deep into German-held territory. The enemy could no longer move freely during daylight hours, and the sniper section had new hunting grounds to exploit. On June 15th, Cakebread and Treacher pushed further east than they had ever operated before. They passed through the ruins of Breville, still littered with bodies and burned-out vehicles, and established a hide overlooking the road to Troarn. German reinforcements moving toward the front had to use this road. Every truck, every staff car, every motorcycle courier presented a potential target. They waited until 09:45. Then a German Kubelwagen appeared on the road, moving fast, trailing a plume of dust. Cakebread tracked it through his scope, but held his fire. A single vehicle was not worth revealing his position. 20 minutes later, a convoy appeared. 3 trucks loaded with infantry, escorted by an armored car. The vehicles were bunched together, moving too fast for the narrow road. The lead truck's driver was focused on the route ahead, not on the hedgerows 200 yards to his left. Cakebread aimed for the driver. At this range, the shot was almost simple. He squeezed the trigger, worked the bolt, and fired again before the first round struck. The truck veered off the road and plowed into a ditch. Soldiers spilled from the back, scrambling for cover. The following vehicles braked hard, their occupants uncertain what had happened. Cakebread and Treacher did not stay to count the casualties. They were already moving, crawling through a drainage channel that led back toward the British lines. Behind them, German soldiers fired blindly into the hedgerows, hitting nothing. By late June, Cakebread's confirmed kills had passed 20. He had become one of the most effective snipers in the entire 1st Special Service Brigade. Other marksmen in the section had comparable skills, but few matched his patience, his ability to wait for hours without moving, his instinct for knowing when to shoot and when to remain hidden. The Germans knew someone was out there. They did not know his name or his face, but they knew the pattern: single shots from impossible distances. Officers and NCOs targeted with precision. No warning, no chance to react, no way to strike back at an enemy who was gone before the sound of the gunshot faded. They called him a ghost. They called him a devil. They doubled the guards on their command posts and forbade officers from carrying binoculars or maps in the open. None of it helped. Cakebread kept hunting. The hedgerows of Normandy had become his barber shop, and he was giving the Germans the closest shave of their lives. But the static war could not last forever. By early July, the Allied breakout was coming. Operation Goodwood would send British armor crashing through the German lines east of Caen, and when the front began to move, the careful, methodical work of the sniper would give way to something far more chaotic. The question was whether Cakebread would survive long enough to see it. July brought rain and mud and the grinding continuation of the same war. The Orne Bridgehead remained static, a pocket of British-held territory surrounded on 3 sides by German forces determined to push the invaders back into the sea. Every day brought artillery duels, patrol clashes, and the constant threat of a major German counterattack that never quite materialized. Cakebread's routine continued. Before dawn, move out, find a position, watch, wait. Kill if the opportunity presented itself. Withdraw before dark, sleep for a few hours in a slit trench, repeat. The physical toll was considerable. Weeks of sleeping in wet holes, eating cold rations, and maintaining constant vigilance had reduced the commandos to exhausted shadows of the men who had stormed ashore on D-Day. Cakebread had lost weight he could not afford to lose. His uniform hung loose on his frame. The smell of cordite and unwashed bodies had become so familiar he no longer noticed it. But the killing continued. On July 3rd, Cakebread observed a German sniper establishing a position in a ruined barn approximately 500 yards from the British lines. The man was good. He moved carefully, used available cover, and took his time selecting his hide. Under other circumstances, Cakebread might have admired his fieldcraft. Instead, he watched through his scope as the Germans settled into position and began scanning the British perimeter. The enemy sniper was focused on targets to his front. He did not consider that another hunter might be watching from his flank. Cakebread waited until the German raised his rifle to take a shot. At that moment, the enemy's attention would be entirely consumed by his own target. His peripheral vision would narrow. His awareness of his surroundings would diminish. The shot took the German sniper through the temple. He slumped forward over his rifle and did not move again. It was Cakebread's 23rd confirmed kill. The sniper war within the sniper war had claimed another casualty. By mid-July, the strategic situation in Normandy was shifting. The Americans had finally broken out of the bocage country around St. Lo and were driving south into Brittany. British and Canadian forces launched Operation Goodwood on July 18th, sending 3 armored divisions crashing through the German lines east of Caen. The static war was ending. The front was beginning to move. For the men of the Orne Bridgehead, Goodwood meant relief was coming. Fresh divisions would push through their positions and take over the advance. The exhausted commandos and paratroopers who had held this ground since D-Day would finally be withdrawn for rest and refitting. But first, they had to survive the German response. The enemy knew what Goodwood meant. If the British broke through east of Caen, the entire German position in Normandy would collapse. Reinforcements that had been held in reserve were rushed forward to plug the gaps. Panzer divisions that had been conserved for a decisive counterattack were thrown into the defensive battle piecemeal. The fighting around the bridgehead intensified as the Germans made one final effort to eliminate the threat to their flank. On July 20th, Cakebread was operating near the village of Tufreville when German artillery caught his patrol in the open. The barrage came without warning, shells falling in a pattern designed to saturate the area with shrapnel. Cakebread threw himself into a crater and pressed his face into the mud as explosions walked across the field around him. When the shelling stopped, he raised his head and saw Tretcher lying motionless 20 yards away. His partner had taken a fragment through the shoulder. Blood soaked through his uniform and pooled in the churned earth beneath him. Cakebread crawled to Tretcher's position, applied a field dressing to the wound, and began dragging him back toward the British lines. It took 2 hours to cover 600 yards, moving in short bursts between shell craters, freezing every time German observers might be watching. Tretcher survived. He was evacuated to England and would eventually return to duty, though not in time to rejoin the Normandy campaign. Cakebread had lost his spotter, his partner, the man who had watched his back through 6 weeks of the most intense combat either of them had ever experienced. The sniper section assigned Cakebread a new partner within days. The war did not pause for grief or adjustment. There were still Germans to kill, still positions to observe, still intelligence to gather. The breakout was accelerating, and the commandos would soon be on the move again. On September 7, 1944, the 1st Special Service Brigade was finally withdrawn from France. They had been in continuous combat for 93 days, from the landing on Sword Beach to the pursuit across the Seine. The brigade had suffered over 800 casualties, nearly 40% of its original strength. Cakebread walked onto the transport ship at Southampton with his rifle slung over his shoulder and his kit bag hanging from his hand. Behind him lay the hedgerows of Normandy, the ruined villages, the fields where he had learned to kill with a precision that still surprised him. Ahead lay rest, retraining, and eventually another campaign. The war was not over. Germany had not surrendered. There would be more fighting before the end. But for now, Marine Derrick Cakebread was alive. More than 30 Germans were not. And somewhere in the records of the 1st Special Service Brigade, his name was being added to a very short list of men who had proven themselves masters of the deadliest art in modern warfare. The transport docked at Southampton on September 8, 1944. Cakebread stepped onto English soil for the first time in 3 months, carrying equipment that weighed half what it had on D-Day. Everything non-essential had been discarded, lost, or destroyed during the campaign. What remained was a rifle, ammunition, and the hard-earned knowledge of how to use them. The commandos were sent to Petworth for initial processing, then to Eastney Barracks at Southsea, and finally to Bexhill on the Sussex coast. The routine of garrison life felt alien after months of combat. Hot meals, clean uniforms, beds with mattresses. Cakebread slept 14 hours the first night and woke disoriented, reaching for a rifle that was not beside him. The brigade needed time to absorb replacements and rebuild its shattered units. 45 Commando had landed in France with approximately 450 men. Fewer than 300 had walked off the transport at Southampton. The gaps in the ranks were filled with fresh volunteers from the Royal Marines Depot, young men who had completed commando training but had never heard a shot fired in anger. Cakebread was no longer a junior Marine. His experience in Normandy had elevated him to the status of veteran, one of the men who had been there from the beginning and survived. The new replacements looked at him differently than they looked at each other. They asked questions about what combat was really like, then fell silent when his answers contained no glory and no excitement. He told them the truth. Combat was waiting. Combat was fear. Combat was killing men who had done nothing to you personally, whose faces you saw through a telescopic sight in the moment before you ended their lives. There was no hatred in it. There was no satisfaction. There was only the job, performed as efficiently as possible, repeated until someone told you to stop or until someone killed you first. The weeks in England passed slowly. Training resumed, but it felt hollow to men who had already proven themselves in the ultimate test. They practiced amphibious landings on beaches that resembled the ones they had already stormed. They fired on ranges at targets that did not shoot back. They waited for orders that everyone knew were coming. Those orders arrived in January 1945. The 1st Special Service Brigade, now redesignated the 1st Commando Brigade, was deploying to the Netherlands. The war had stalled in the flooded lowlands along the Maas River, and commando units were needed to conduct operations in terrain too difficult for conventional infantry. On January 14th, Cakebread boarded a transport at Tilbury docks. The crossing to Ostend took 18 hours through winter seas that pitched the ship violently enough to send unsecured equipment crashing across the deck. From Ostend, the commandos moved forward by truck through a landscape of frozen fields and shattered villages. The Netherlands in January was a different war from Normandy in June. The ground was frozen solid or flooded with icy water. Snow covered the fields and outlined every movement against the white background. The Germans had been fighting for 5 years and showed no signs of surrendering. If anything, they fought harder as the Allies closed in on the Reich. 45 Commando was tasked with operations around the towns of Maasbracht and Brochterbeek. The enemy had established strong defensive positions along the Montforterbeek, a small river that formed a natural obstacle to any advance. Taking these positions would require the same combination of firepower, maneuver, and individual courage that had won the Orne Bridgehead. On January 23rd, a troop advanced along the station road toward Maasbracht. Cakebread moved with the lead element, his sniper rifle ready. The commandos had reached a crossroads when German machine guns opened fire from prepared positions along the dike. The troop was caught in a kill zone, with bullets coming from multiple directions and no cover within reach. Men fell in the first seconds of the ambush. Those who survived threw themselves into the frozen fields or scrambled for the shelter of nearby buildings. German mortars joined the machine guns, dropping rounds among the scattered commandos with terrible precision. A well-positioned enemy sniper added to the chaos, picking off anyone who tried to move. Cakebread crawled into a drainage ditch and began scanning for the German marksmen. The snow made concealment difficult, but it also made targets easier to spot. He saw movement near a farmhouse 200 yards away. A rifle barrel protruding from a window, the distinctive shape of a telescopic sight catching the winter light. He steadied his breathing. The cold made his fingers stiff, and he had to concentrate on maintaining a smooth trigger pull. The German sniper was focused on the commandos pinned in the open, unaware that another predator had found him. Cakebread fired once. The rifle barrel in the window disappeared, but the ambush was far from over. A troop remained pinned down, taking casualties with each passing minute. Medical personnel sheltering in a nearby house could see wounded men lying in the snow-covered fields, crying for help they could not provide. Dr. John Tulloch, the Royal Army Medical Corps officer attached to a troop, watched the situation deteriorate and made a decision. He arranged for jeeps marked with Red Cross insignia to drive into the killing zone and extract the wounded. It was a desperate gamble that depended entirely on whether the Germans would respect the rules of war. The outcome of that gamble would determine who lived and who died in the frozen fields of Maasbracht. The jeeps drove into the open under the Red Cross flag. German fire slackened, but did not stop entirely. Bullets cracked overhead as medical personnel loaded wounded commandos onto the vehicles and drove them back to safety. Dr. Tulloch made multiple trips into the killing zone, each time risking his life on the assumption that the enemy would honor the Geneva Convention. Most of the wounded were evacuated, but a troop had been shattered. The ambush at Maasbracht cost 45 Commando some of its most experienced men, veterans who had survived D-Day and the Orne Bridgehead, only to die in a frozen Dutch field 8 months later. Cakebread survived. He continued operating as a sniper through the winter, fighting in the Netherlands and into the final push into Germany itself. The Commando Brigade crossed the Weser River in April 1945 and advanced toward the Baltic coast. German resistance was collapsing, but pockets of fanatics still fought with suicidal determination. There was killing to be done until the very last day. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Cakebread was somewhere in northern Germany when the ceasefire took effect. He had been in combat, intermittently, for 11 months. His confirmed kill count stood at more than 30 Germans, one of the highest tallies recorded by any British sniper in the Normandy campaign. There were no medals for what he had done. Snipers did not receive the kind of recognition given to men who charged machine gun nests or led bayonet assaults. Their work was too quiet, too patient, too removed from the heroic narratives that military decorations were designed to celebrate. Cakebread returned to England with the same rank he had held on D-Day, Marine, nothing more. He went home to Tottenham. The barbershop was still there, somehow undamaged by the German bombs that had fallen on London throughout the war. His old clients returned, older now, grayer, marked by years of rationing and blackouts, and the constant fear of air raids. They sat in his chair and asked him what the war had been like. Cakebread did not tell them about the German officer he had shot through the chest at 400 yards. He did not describe the enemy sniper he had killed in the ruined barn, or the truck driver whose death had sent a convoy into chaos. He talked about the weather in Normandy, the food, the mud, the things that civilians could understand without having their image of war disturbed. The Imperial War Museum recorded his testimony decades later. In that interview, Cakebread spoke more freely about his experiences, describing the sniper course at Penally, the commando training at Aknakari, the long days in the hedgerows waiting for a target to appear. His voice was calm and matter-of-fact, the voice of a man who had made peace with what he had done. Lord Lovett mentioned him by name in his memoirs, March Past, published in 1978. The brigadier described Cakebread as one of the best snipers in the commando, a hairdresser who had accounted for over 30 Germans in the Normandy campaign alone. It was a rare acknowledgement for a man who had spent the war invisible, hidden in hedgerows, killing from distances where his targets never knew he existed. The skills that made Cakebread deadly were the same skills that had made him a good barber: steady hands, patience, attention to detail, the ability to remain calm and focused while performing precise work. The British Army had recognized something in his records that Cakebread himself had never considered. A man who could cut hair to within a millimeter of perfection could also place a bullet exactly where it needed to go. 45 Commando still exists today. It is based at RM Condor in Arbroath, Scotland, and remains one of the elite units of the Royal Marines. The young men who wear the green beret now train with weapons and technology that Cakebread could never have imagined. But the fundamental skills remain the same: patience, precision, the willingness to wait for hours, days, weeks for the moment when a single shot can change everything. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about hairdressers who became snipers, about ordinary men who discovered extraordinary skills, about patience and precision in the chaos of war. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Derrick Cakebread does not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.